Welcome, everyone. My name is Kate Suits. I'm an educator at the Illinois State Museum, and thank you all for joining us for Ulysses S. Grant and Race. I'm now going to introduce our speaker tonight. Nick Sacco is a park ranger with the National Park Service at Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site in St. Louis, Missouri. He regularly gives tours of Grant's Whitehaven estate, designs education programs, and conducts historical research for the park. He has published numerous works of scholarship, including an article for the Journal of the Civil War Era on Grant's relationship with slavery. In addition to working for the National Park Service, Nick is also an adjunct professor of history for the University of Missouri, St. Louis, and IUPUI. So I will turn everything over to Nick.
Well, thank you, Kate. I appreciate that. Good evening, everybody, from wherever you are in the country and in the world. I really appreciate the privilege of your time. So, as you probably know, tomorrow, Wednesday, April 27th, is the 200th birthday of Ulysses S. Grant. So, it is particularly appropriate to have conversations about Ulysses S. Grant's life and legacy. This is a wonderful opportunity to talk not just about Grant, but about the causes, context, and consequences of the American Civil War to American history as well. So in working at Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site for a number of years, I've developed quite an interest in trying to analyze Ulysses S. Grant's attitudes towards race and his relationships and sort of assumptions and attitudes towards different racial groups in the 19th century, and trying to see what we might learn about not just Grant, but other people like him in the 19th century to try to better understand the role of race in American society during the Civil War era. So Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site, as mentioned, is in St. Louis, Missouri. We are about 12 miles southwest of the Gateway Arch. So we're in the St. Louis suburbs. This house, although painted a funny green color, is called Whitehaven. And this is the historic home that was Ulysses S. Grant's wife, Julia Dent Grant. This was her childhood home. Ulysses S. Grant met Julia here at Whitehaven while stationed with the U.S. Army in St. Louis. He began his relationship with Julia at this house. He even proposed to Julia on the front porch. And for 5 years, from 1854 to 59, Grant lived at Whitehaven and made a living as a farmer on this property. Equally important, as we'll talk about a little bit later, this was a place of enslavement. And while Grant lived at Whitehaven, there were upwards of 30 enslaved African Americans who were enslaved by the Dent family during this time. So this will shape some of Grant's racial views at the time. So in any case, we are a unit of the National Park Service. We give tours 7 days a week of President Grant's home. And it's fun because I get to talk about history for a living. So let's kind of start with a broad picture first of all. Now, race in the 19th century, I think there's a couple things to keep in mind. One is stratification. I think about the term stratification. Many scientists in the 19th century, political and cultural leaders, were very interested in trying to find differences between different groups of people based on race. So trying to find distinctions between different racial groups and then categorizing those racial groups and creating racial hierarchies. So we can see this playing out in a couple different ways. And we see sort of an interesting intersection of religion and science in the 19th century. So from a religious perspective, during Ulysses S. Grant's lifetime, we will see very decisive splits within the Protestant denominations over the morality of slavery. So we'll see denominations like the Baptist and Methodist breaking off into northern and southern denominations over disagreements as to whether or not the Bible sanctioned slavery. And many white Americans believed that it did sanction slavery and that the Bible accepted slavery. At the same time, white scientists at this time are trying to have debates and discussions about different concepts such as monogenism and polygenism. So monogenism is sort of the theory that all humans come from a similar ancestry. And then polygenism is the idea that different racial groups have different origins and that they're not the same species, so that there's multiple types of species within humanity. And so many of these polygenists in particular are working to try to create a racialized hierarchy and trying to establish the concept of white Americans sort of being at the top of this racial hierarchy. So during Ulysses S. Grant's lifetime, there are Black exclusion laws in most states around the country, both North and South. Grant himself, I do strongly believe that he held nativist sentiments. I believe he was very skeptical of foreign-born immigrants who came to the United States, and we'll discuss that a little bit later in this presentation. I think Ulysses S. Grant, within the context of his time, I think you see both progressive and regressive views on race. There are times where Grant sounds very far ahead for his time, and then there's other times where he does not sound very far ahead for his time. So it's complex, to say the least. And what I would argue here with this presentation is that Grant's views and his assumptions, his perceptions of different racial groups has a lot to do with his views about patriotism and loyalty in the United States. And so what I mean by that is that if Grant has sort of this assumption that a particular racial group are loyal Americans and understand the duties of being a patriotic American citizen, that greatly shapes his perception of that race as a whole. So I'll make sure to sort of spell out that distinction throughout this presentation. Now we're going to look at several different groups that interacted with Grant throughout his life: African Americans, Native Americans, Jewish Americans, and Chinese Americans. So we're going to just look at a variety of different case studies for Grant's life. We're going to start with Grant and African Americans. Now, as I mentioned, most states in the Union had Black exclusion laws before the Civil War. What this means is that these states prevented a free person of color from immigrating to those states and making a settlement in those states. You might be very surprised to see northern states like Iowa, Michigan, Illinois, and Indiana that had Black exclusion laws. In Illinois, in 1853, John Logan, who later becomes a Civil War general, is going to author a bill excluding Black immigrants from making their way into Illinois. So for the case of Ulysses S. Grant, it's important to point out that when he is born in 1822 and throughout his upbringing in Ohio, he lived in a state with a Black exclusion law. So while Ohio most certainly has a strong Underground Railroad community and a strong anti-slavery sentiment throughout the state, we need to be careful not to conflate abolitionists with anti-slavery thinkers. People who had abolitionist thoughts wanted the complete eradication of slavery immediately without compensation to slaveholders. But anti-slavery thinkers didn't always feel that way. Sometimes they supported gradual emancipation, sometimes they supported compensation to slaveholders, and many anti-slavery Northerners held a strong racial prejudice against Black Americans and wanted to prevent them from settling in the northern states. So it is very important to reinforce that even though Grant grows up with strong anti-slavery values in his Ohio home, he is also in a culture where free people of color were not allowed to immigrate to his state. Now, Grant is going to have quite a relationship with slavery, and I actually differ with many Grant historians. Perhaps most notably, Ron Chernow in his 2017 book makes a very vocal argument in the book that Grant held strong anti-slavery opinions before the Civil War. And frankly, working at Whitehaven has convinced me that I don't think Grant was that strongly anti-slavery before the war. Now, like Abraham Lincoln, Grant marries into a slaveholding family by marrying Julia Dent Grant here in St. Louis and marrying into the Dent family. During Grant's time at Whitehaven, One could argue that in some ways, Grant is trying to emulate his slaveholding father-in-law, Frederick Dent, by choosing to come to Whitehaven in 1854 to make a living as a farmer on the Whitehaven property. During Grant's time in St. Louis, we unfortunately don't have a lot of primary source documents to really point us towards a defined position for Grant when it comes to slavery, but there are a couple actions we can look at. For example, in the presidential election of 1856, we see the first major candidate for the Republican Party emerge. That'll be John C. Fremont, who runs against the Democrat James Buchanan. Now, the Republican Party had been formed in 1854 on the idea that slavery should not be allowed to expand into new Western territories. They wanted to draw a line in the sand and prevent slavery's further westward growth. If Grant held strongly anti-slavery views, he had an opportunity in 1856 to express those views by voting for John C. Fremont as the Republican candidate for president. In reality, Grant ends up voting for James Buchanan, who is a Northerner, but very sympathetic to Southerners and very sympathetic to slavery. Grant will later go on to say that he felt that James Buchanan was the only presidential candidate who had a national appeal that would prevent a civil war from breaking out. So much for that. But in any case, Grant aligns more with a Northern Democrat view. He believes that slavery, there could be further compromises on slavery. And he says in his personal memoirs that he disagreed with Abraham Lincoln's argument that the country could not exist half slave and half free. Grant admitted that in the 1850s, he didn't agree with that view. While at Whitehaven, Grant used what's called the hiring out system. In St. Louis, it was very common for prominent enslavers in the area to sign contracts with other farmers to hire out their enslaved people to other farmers in the St. Louis area. Grant takes advantage of the hiring out system, and we know that he utilizes at least 2 enslaved people from other slaveholders in St. Louis to assist him in his farming endeavor at Whitehaven. Most notably, Grant enslaved a man named William Jones while at the Whitehaven estate. As a matter of fact, Grant is the last president out of 12 in our country's history to have been a slaveholder. So Grant, in 1859, a few months before leaving St. Louis, he does make the decision to free William Jones. One way of looking at this is that Grant was uncomfortable with slavery and decided that he was going to make a strike against slavery by freeing William Jones instead of selling him for a profit. But a different view on that might ask why Grant has ownership of a person in the first place. When the American Civil War broke out, Grant was he actually strongly believed that the war with the Confederacy would be very short. His greatest concern was a mass slave insurrection in the South in response to Confederate secession. And he writes several letters to his father-in-law stating his belief that the U.S. Army would gladly go into the Confederate states and do what it could to protect slavery to convince Southerners not to leave the Union. In 1863, shortly after the conclusion of the Vicksburg campaign, Grant wrote a letter to Illinois Congressman Elihu Washburn of Galena, Illinois, and he admitted in this letter that, quote, "I never was an abolitionist, nor what could be called anti-slavery before the Civil War." So Grant, that is perhaps the most explicit admittance from him that he did not necessarily oppose slavery in the years before the Civil War. The political cartoon that we see here on the left, this is a very clever cartoon in which when Grant ran for president after the Civil War, this cartoon is trying to argue that Grant could not be trusted to protect Black civil rights. And you can see the top right corner, it says, "Vote for Buchanan in extension to slavery," and Grant, the hardscrabble St. Louis farmer, is casting his ballot for James Buchanan. Kind of hard to see in the bottom left corner, but that is the manumission paper Grant signs freeing William Jones in 1859. It is important to stress, though, that Grant evolves. Grant does not hold these somewhat pro-slavery views for the remainder of his life. The American Civil War genuinely changes Grant. He comes to understand and appreciate that Black Americans were self-liberating from slavery. They were anxious to provide intelligence to the United States military, and 180,000 Black men will serve in Grant's army following the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. This genuinely makes an impression on Grant. Historian Brooks Simpson famously argues that for Grant, by the end of the Civil War, it's no longer about the color of one's skin, but the color of one's uniform. So I genuinely believe that Grant comes around to embrace the end of slavery following the Emancipation Proclamation. And he's going to continue this as he's elected president in 1868. The 15th Amendment will be strongly supported by President Grant. The 15th Amendment opens up a door for all men, regardless of color, to have the ability to vote in elections here in the United States. So it bars racial discrimination at the polls, and a person could not be prevented from voting based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Grant personally lobbies the governor of Nebraska. He communicates with his allies within the Republican Party to push for the 15th Amendment's ratification. And upon the ratification of the 15th Amendment, Grant argues that it was the greatest civil change to the United States since the founding of the nation. So for Grant, it was not the Emancipation Proclamation or the Battle of Gettysburg or anything from the Civil War. It was the 15th Amendment that was the greatest civil change to American society, which shows you how strongly he felt about the right for Black men in particular to have the right to vote. And Grant believes that they have earned the right to vote through their service in the Union military during the Civil War. Grant will continue his advocacy for civil rights. He personally lobbies Congress to establish the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice is tasked specifically with fighting the Ku Klux Klan in the South and trying to stop terroristic violence against African Americans in the South. So the Department of Justice still to this day, it has its roots in its fight against the Ku Klux Klan during Grant's presidency. Grant will also sign into law 3 enforcement acts in 1870 and 71. These enforcement acts authorized Grant to call out the U.S. military to fight against the Ku Klux Klan. And in 1871, he will mobilize the military to shut down the Ku Klux Klan in South Carolina. So the KKK is effectively destroyed by the end of Grant's first term. Grant will also he will sign the Civil Rights Act of 1875 during his second term. This remarkable piece of legislation ended racial discrimination in public conveyances, such as streetcars and trains, at hotels, at theaters. It outlawed racial discrimination in cemeteries, and it outlawed racial discrimination in juries. Unfortunately, this law only lasted for 8 years and will be later overturned by the Supreme Court. But this is the last Civil Rights Act that will be passed by Congress until 1957. So it's more than 80 years until Congress passes another civil rights law following Grant's presidency. We also see a change here where Grant is pushing forward this idea that the federal government had a responsibility to enforce civil rights. Prior to the Civil War, the federal government did not concern itself with promoting racial, political, or legal equality. But the Grant administration is really going to be the first administration to try to oversee this idea that Americans had certain rights that were protected through federal enforcement, through groups like the Department of Justice and through federal laws and the Constitution. So Grant has quite an evolution when it comes to African Americans. Let's move to Jewish Americans. Now, Grant, during the American Civil War, he is tasked, along with other generals in the U.S. Army, with enforcing a military blockade of Confederate ports. This comes from President Lincoln at the very beginning of the war. He's going to institute a military blockade to stop trade within the Confederacy. Confederacy has a very strong trade with Europe, particularly in products like cotton, and Lincoln wants to try to stop that. So Grant, he is trying to enforce this military blockade of Confederate ports, but he's running into a lot of trouble And as a matter of fact, he's running into trouble thanks to his own father. Grant's father, Jesse Root Grant, is a very successful businessman. He is a tanner, so he deals with leather goods. And Jesse Grant decides during the Civil War that he wants to get in on illegal cotton smuggling. There are smugglers that are going into the Confederate States, grabbing cotton and selling it. They're speculating and selling it at highly inflated prices in the North. Jesse Grant will partner with two Jewish brothers in Cincinnati, Ohio, the Mack brothers. Grant, in December of 1862, he gets word of this. He hears about his father's involvement with illegal cotton smuggling and is particularly outraged because his father tried to ask him to allow the Mack brothers to go through Grant's own military lines to get this cotton smuggled into the North. When Grant should have issued an order against illegal cotton smuggling, and when he should have condemned his father's actions, he instead decided to condemn all Jewish people. Very famous order in December of 62, General Orders number 11, which states in part that, quote, the Jews as a class violating every regulation of trade by the Treasury Department are hereby expelled from the department. So what this means tangibly is that Jewish families are going to be expelled from their homes within Grant's military lines in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Mississippi. To cite one example, immediately there were 30 Jewish families in Paducah, Kentucky that were forcibly removed from their homes by the US military following General Orders number 11. Now, Jewish community leaders in Paducah went all the way to Washington, D.C., talked to Abraham Lincoln, and within a week of General Orders number 11 being issued, it was rescinded by President Lincoln. Nevertheless, this is a huge black stain on Grant's reputation in issuing this order to expel all Jewish people from his military lines. You'll see here on the left, this is a very good book called When General Grant Expelled the Jews. It's by historian Jonathan D. Sarna, and it's a really nice historical analysis of this order and Grant's relationship with Jewish Americans. Now, having said that, Grant once again does evolve in his thinking, and he does try to take steps to make amends for his mistake. When Grant runs for president in 1868, this is actually a very major issue, and the Jewish community is vocal in their concerns about Grant being elected president and what he might do for Jewish rights in the United States. So shortly after Grant was elected president, he did end up writing a letter to a Jewish congressman from Chicago named Isaac Morris. And in that letter, Grant went on to say that he did not support the spirit of General Orders number 11, and that it was a mistake to issue the order, and that he firmly believed that all Americans should be treated equally under the law. So Grant, essentially, he apologizes for General Orders number 11, and he tries to take tangible action during his presidency. He appoints a record number of Jewish Americans to government offices during his 8 years as president. He speaks out against the persecution of Jews in Europe and throughout Russia as well. In particular, there was a lot of crimes against Jewish people in Romania during Grant's presidency, and he will call upon the United States to use their ambassadors, their ministers in Romania to call out against this and to try to stop the persecution of Jews throughout Europe and Russia. And in a symbolic move, Grant attended the opening ceremony for Adas Israel Congregation, which was a synagogue in Washington, D.C. That was, they had their opening ceremony in 1876 towards the end of Grant's presidency. Grant was invited to attend the opening ceremony, and he and Julia stayed for the entire 3-hour ceremony in an effort to try to build solidarity with the Jewish community. So Grant genuinely does try to take actions later on after the Civil War to make amends for General Orders number 11. Now, once again, this is something that can be interpreted a number of different ways. The political cartoon on the left is from 1882, and the argument of this political cartoon is that Grant's apologies and his efforts to promote goodwill with Jewish people were crocodile tears. Long story short, the argument here is that Grant is doing this for political purposes. He's trying to support the Republican Party. He does not really care about the fate of Jewish people. He's just trying to do this for politics. That's one way to look at it. Then again, Many Jewish people mourned Grant's death in 1885, and many Jewish people from around the world donated to the Grant Monument Association, which was tasked with erecting a large mausoleum that currently is in New York City today, Grant's tomb. So there are multiple ways to look at this, and it's a fair question to see whether or not Grant is truly deserving of redemption for this action in his life. Now, moving on, Grant and Native Americans. Grant, during his time in the military before the Civil War, he writes a little bit about Native Americans. He interacted with Indians in Mexico during the Mexican-American War, and he will continue interactions with Native Americans while in the West, particularly while stationed at Fort Vancouver in what is today the state of Washington. Now, Grant, importantly, he did not fight in any Indian wars or any military conflicts with indigenous tribes before the Civil War. So he is somewhat unique in that he served in the pre-Civil War U.S. Army, but did not engage in military conflicts. And interestingly enough, Grant, when he writes about Native Americans in the 1850s, he sincerely believes that Indians had been, in his words, put upon by the whites. In a letter to Julia in 1853, he said to Julia, quote, "You charge me to be cautious about riding out alone at Fort Vancouver, lest the Indians should get me. It is really my opinion that the whole race would be harmless and peaceable if they were not put upon by the whites." And in another letter in 1853, he said that, quote, "There are but few Indians in the vicinity of the post. These few are of the Klickitat tribe. This poor remnant of a once powerful tribe is fast wasting away before those blessings of civilization, whiskey and smallpox." So Grant very perceptively notes that the tribes of the West, even though white Americans are proclaiming that they're bringing the blessings of civilization to the West, that Native American tribes are in fact dying in great numbers due to these blessings of civilization. Grant is also greatly influenced by Ely S. Parker. Ely Parker is a member of the Seneca Nation. He was born in New York. He is going to move to Galena, Illinois shortly before the Civil War, and Ulysses S. Grant, living in Galena in 1860, he befriends Parker, and the two men become close friends. Parker, for the first couple of years of the war, he was unable to get into the U.S. Army because only white men could serve in the Union Army. But Grant himself is going to pull some strings, and in 1863, he will add Parker to his staff. Parker will be present at Appomattox Courthouse, and he will actually be tasked by Grant to use his handwriting to write out the terms of surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Grant and Parker, he views Parker as somebody who successfully, as a Native American, successfully assimilates into American culture, sort of the Anglo-Saxon white Protestant culture of America. And Parker has become a successful embodiment of what Grant views when it comes to assimilation. So Grant, he strongly believes that previous government policy towards indigenous tribes and indigenous people had been an utter failure. In his first message to Congress, Grant stated that, quote, "From the foundation of the government to the present, the management of the original inhabitants of this continent, the Indian, has been one of embarrassment and expense, and has been attended with continuous robberies, murders, and wars." So Grant is very readily embracing the idea that governmental policy towards indigenous tribes had been a failure in previous administrations. However, Grant, on the one hand, while he opposes outright extermination of the tribes, as I've alluded to, he supports assimilation. He supports this idea of Native Americans sort of giving up their old ways to become American citizens. Kill the Indian, save the man. And this is particularly ironic given that Grant had criticized the blessings of civilizations while with the Army in the 1850s. So in the same message to Congress in 1869, Grant also said that, quote, "A system which looks to the extinction of a race is too abhorrent for a nation to indulge in without entailing upon the wrath of all Christendom. no matter what ought to be relations between such settlements and the Aborigines, the fact is they do not get on together, and one or the other has to give way in the end. I see no remedy for this except in placing all Indians on large reservations as rapidly as can be done and giving them absolute protection there. So Grant believes that Indians and white Americans cannot coexist together. He concedes that westward expansion and ideals of manifest destiny are a reality and will come to fruition, and that the best thing for Native Americans is to be placed in reservations and protected by the U.S. government. So Grant is most certainly an assimilationist, and we can see here that he has a different attitude, a more paternalistic view towards Native Americans as compared to African Americans and other racial groups in America. So what we'll see here is Grant is going to have a so-called peace policy that he's going to push forward. In his inaugural address to the nation, he said that he had supported any course towards Indians which would tend to their civilization, Christianization, and ultimate citizenship. We should remember that the 14th Amendment to the Constitution establishes the concept of birthright citizenship, except for Indians who do not pay taxes, which is a reference to Indians who live within a tribal organization. They're a member of an indigenous tribe. So technically speaking, Indians who lived within a tribe were considered part of a sovereign nation, were considered not citizens of the United States, which is why Grant is talking about his support to eventually have them become citizens. So what does it really mean to civilize Native Americans? In Grant's view, that entailed a number of things. One, it entailed Native Americans learning English, becoming Christian, learning how to farm. So giving up their previous hunting and gathering ways and learning how to become farmers. And ultimately, it is also about destroying indigenous sovereignty and tribal sovereignty. The Grant administration and the federal government as a whole is looking to consolidate its power by removing tribal authority in the United States. They want Native Americans to have their ultimate loyalties to the US government and not their tribes. So this is going to build in with a larger support for westward expansion and economic growth in the West. As the country grows, as more settlers are making their way into the West, the Grant administration wants to maintain peace with the Native American tribes, but at the same time, they're willing to bargain, to take land from the Native American tribes, and they are essentially looking to assimilate Native Americans into the body politic. So I think a good representation of Grant's views is really expressed nicely by Thomas Nast, the famous political cartoonist of the Reconstruction era. In this political cartoon, we can see Grant puffing on a cigar, and he's helping an indigenous man change into sort of the white man's clothes, a suit, a bow tie, and whatnot. So the indigenous man, in his pockets, he's got taxes and he's got the vote. So this idea, again, that Native Americans, they are no longer members of their tribe, but they're citizens of the United States who are paying taxes and voting in elections. We can also see farm tools to the right, representing the transition from hunting and gathering to becoming farmers. And then there's even up here at the top, fire water, sort of subtly suggesting that perhaps there were maybe not so coercive ways to try to force Native Americans into assimilating into white ways during the Reconstruction era. So we can see that kind of embodied here in this Thomas Nast cartoon. Another representation of the spirit of manifest destiny is a very famous painting by John Gast called American Progress. This was painted during Grant's presidency. So we can see on the right, we have the woman represents Columbia. So she represents liberty. She's got a school book in her hand, and she's holding a telegraph wire that's being installed into the West. Trains, carriages, farmers, they're making their way into the new Western territories, and there's bright skies, and these bright skies are making their way. But meanwhile, in the West, the dark West, we see indigenous people running away, the bison being run off, and storm clouds in the back. So while Grant, again, he's trying to promote peace with the Native American tribes, he also strongly believes that westward expansion is a good thing for the nation, and that westward growth among white settlers should be facilitated. So the policy for Grant, some of the tribes supported Grant's peace policy. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, and Chickasaw nations wrote a letter to Grant at the beginning of his presidency, praising him for his new approach to Indian relations with the U.S. government. And Grant, when he originally wanted the U.S. military to oversee all Indian reservations and trading posts. Congress passes a law barring the military from participating in those activities. So Grant is going to instead look to religious leaders, Quakers, Baptists, Catholics, and Methodists, and he will appoint religious leaders to oversee reservations and Indian trading posts. So again, some of the tribes do genuinely support these policies. They support the peace policy and they support assimilation into mainstream American society. Legislation will be passed promoting land development. So among different things, the Timber Culture Act, the General Mining Act, the Desert Lands Act, these are all acts of legislation encouraging white settlers to acquire new lands in the Western territories and to develop those lands. And most significantly, I think the US government ends the treaty system with tribes in 1871. The reason, again, is that the government is looking to destroy tribal sovereignty. And one way to do that is to end all negotiations and treaties with tribes and view them as wards of the state. So even though Grant's intentions may have been good, ultimately, the US military engages in some of its worst military conflicts with the tribes during Grant's presidency. Don't have time to address all of the wars. The Modoc War is a notable war from 1873, but I will remind everybody that the Battle of Little Bighorn took place towards the end of Grant's presidency. The reason for the Battle of Little Bighorn is that the Treaty of Fort Laramie from 1868 had guaranteed to the Lakota and Dakota the Black Hills in what is today South Dakota. And what will happen is that within a number of years during Grant's presidency, George Custer and the U.S. Army will discover gold in the Black Hills. It will spark huge mass migration of white settlers into the Black Hills. The government tries to negotiate the acquisition of the Black Hills from the tribes who refuse that offer. And long story short, it ends up leading to the Battle of Little Bighorn and the U.S. government very shamefully taking the Black Hills from the U.S. government in the wake of the Battle of Little Bighorn. So while Grant, again, had maybe perhaps good intentions here, there are most certainly unintended consequences. And I have no hesitance in saying that there was a cultural genocide of sorts during Grant's presidency. Again, I don't think Grant looked to exterminate Native Americans, but he is most certainly looking to assimilate them and bring them into American society, kind of forcing them to give up their old ways. Okay, the last group I would like to discuss are Chinese Americans here in the United States and Grant's relationship with the Chinese. It is important to stress that before the American Civil War, there were very few federal immigration laws. The most notable law was the Naturalization Act of 1790. So it's a couple of years after the Constitution is ratified. And the Naturalization Act of 1790 says that, quote, any free white person who had been a lawful permanent resident in the United States for at least 2 years could apply to become a naturalized citizen. Now, what this means is that white immigrants could begin the process of naturalization, becoming US citizens, but non-white people could not become citizens. So non-white people could immigrate to the United States without trouble for the most part. However, citizenship and the rights of citizenship are closed off to non-white immigrants in the years before the Civil War. For Chinese people, immigration really begins to take off to California during the California gold rush of the late 1840s. Many Chinese are looking to come to the United States to try to find gold, to bring it back to their families in China, or in some cases to permanently reside in California. What will happen, though, is that many of these Chinese immigrants that want to participate in the California gold rush In many cases, it's almost like a form of indentured servitude, where there would usually be a benefactor or even a business in California that would pay passage for Chinese immigrants to come to California, and then the Chinese immigrants would have to work off the debt that they incurred for payment of passage to California. As a result of this, Chinese men often came to the United States alone, and they did not have the funds to bring their entire families over. So by 1850, for example, in San Francisco, there are 4,000 Chinese people living in San Francisco, and only 7 of them were women. So what happens is that because there are so few Chinese women and these Chinese men are coming by themselves, we see the rise of a prostitution ring. Prostitution is allowed in California. It is legal under California law in the 1850s. So there'll be sort of this network of Chinese immigrants in California, Chinese residents in their home country, but also white businessmen and white men living in California that will establish what are called tongs. And these tongs are essentially a secret prostitution rings. These secret prostitution rings oversee the forced kidnapping of Chinese girls and women who are forced into the sex trade in California. Quite understandably, this is awful and devastating for Chinese women who fight venereal diseases, poverty. Many of these Chinese women often faced a quick death or suicide once they made their way to California. And so many white Americans are very skeptical about this Chinese immigration to the United States. We see some white Americans arguing that Chinese men are working for very low wages. They're degrading the value of labor and taking away jobs from white Americans. Of course, there's also cultural and racial discrimination against Chinese immigrants as well. California Representative Thomas Fitch, who was congressman around the time of Grant's presidency, he sort of summarized it by saying, quote, the Chinese are a distinct civilization, religion, habits, and a language of their own, a race who are alike, incapable and unworthy of assimilation with ours. And he went on to complain that the Chinese refused to learn English, maintain their own lifestyles. They had their own Chinatowns that were exclusionary. They could not assimilate into white society, would not convert to Christianity, and could not function in a Republican form of government. So we see violence against Chinese in California, particularly the Los Angeles massacre of 1871, in which 17 boys and men were killed, and nobody was found guilty of that. And Grant himself is going to be shaped by these debates in California. On the one hand, Grant wants to maintain positive relations with China because there is, even back then, a strong economic trade of goods and people between the United States and China. But the Republican Party during Grant's second term, they are slowly moving away from Reconstruction and the protection of Black Americans. And in that void, there becomes a growing concern about Chinese immigrants within the Republican Party towards the end of Grant's presidency. So Grant, by the end of his presidency, firmly believes that most Chinese immigrants have not arrived voluntarily. He believes that in some cases, even Chinese men are being forcibly brought to the United States in violation of the 13th Amendment. In 1874, Grant, in his message to Congress, said, quote, "I call the attention of Congress to a generally conceded fact that the great proportion of the Chinese immigrants who come to our shores do not come voluntarily to make their homes with us and their labor productive of general prosperity, but come under contracts with headmen who own them almost absolutely." So Grant believes that much of this immigration is forced. And Grant is also very concerned about polygamy as well. And interestingly enough, in 1875, he speaks out against the practice of polygamy, but loops this in with Chinese prostitution in California. In 1875, Grant says that, quote, "that polygamy should exist in a free, enlightened, and Christian country without the power to punish so flagrant a crime seems preposterous. What is needed is a law to punish it as a crime, and at the same time to fix the status of innocent children and of the possibly innocent plural wives. While this is being done, I invite the attention of Congress to another, though perhaps no less an evil, the importation of Chinese women, but few of whom are brought to our shores to pursue honorable or useful occupations. So on the one hand, Grant is framing the institution of polygamy as creating innocent victims of the sex trade in women in polygamous relationships. And he argues that this is harmful to children. But when it comes to prostitution within the Chinese community, Chinese women are blamed for the problem. And he calls upon legislation to act against Chinese women instead of the men who participate in these prostitution rings or trying to look at prostitution itself. So we see within the Republican Party a desire to federalize immigration laws, whereas before the Civil War, most legislation is on the state level. Grant wants federal laws regulating immigration. So the Page Act of 1875 will be one of the very first pieces of legislation in our country's history to specifically exclude a group of people from the United States. The Page Act established federal agents to work at immigration ports to check the identification and to investigate all people coming into the United States. It banned the immigration of Chinese women to the United States on the belief that they were coming as prostitutes to America. It banned felons from immigrating to the United States, and this law acts as a precursor to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Grant does later go on to travel to China and Japan during his world tour and actually mediated a political dispute between China and Japan. He went on to speak very highly of the Chinese and Japanese people during his world tour. But we can see during his presidency that Grant does much to put the federal government in a position to take on enhanced role in immigration law in the United States. Another Thomas Nast cartoon, we see here that the Gate of Liberty, the Golden Gate of Liberty, is closing off the Chinese to the United States. And Nast grabs a quote here where it says, "Enlightened American statesmen, we must draw the line somewhere." So he points out that many of these other people are making their way in the United States and welcomed with open arms, but the Chinese, who Nast considers as industrious, sober, and peaceful, are being excluded from the United States without justification. So, long story short, Grant he is a Republican he explains why he was a Republican in this quote from his world tour. And he went on to say that he was concerned about the Democrats taking power because it was composed of former Confederates in the South and immigrants in the North. And he goes on to say that immigrants who immigrate to the North did not understand what the Union was and were not prepared for the role of American citizenship. So he went on to say that he was a Republican because he was an American and he believed that the duty of all Americans was to save the results of the American Civil War. In the end, here at Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site, we have this sign in our visitor center. This is a famous quote from Grant during his presidency, where he said, quote, "My oft expressed desire is that all citizens, white or black, native or foreign born, may be left free in all parts of our common country to vote, speak, and act in obedience to law, without intimidation or ostracism on account of his views, color, or nativity." Did Ulysses S. Grant live up to the spirit of his own words in 1872? Not all the time. It is clear that Grant certainly held some racial prejudices, particularly a paternalistic view towards Native Americans, bigoted arguments against Jewish Americans, and a lot of skepticism about Chinese Americans, if not bigoted views there too. However, you will not see a president before the Civil War saying anything like this. Grant is certainly trying, he's evolving in his views, and in many ways, Grant's presidency is the first civil rights presidency in pushing for the goals of Reconstruction and this idea that all Americans are entitled to the ability to participate in American society and have equal protection of the laws. And in case of men, all men having the right to vote regardless of color. So as we navigate our own conversations about race in America today, it's useful in looking at Ulysses S. Grant, particularly in how he evolves and changes his thinking over time. If Ulysses S. Grant can do it, we can do it too. So I thank you all for your interest in this presentation. That's all I really have, and I'm very happy to open it up for some questions to wrap up our hour together.
All right, we do have a few questions in the Q&A box. So anybody who has a question, feel free to drop it into the Q&A. All right, we will start with, what was Grant's opinion of John Brown and the raid?
Good question. As a matter of fact, Ulysses S. Grant's father, Jesse Grant, personally knew John Brown and lived with him for several years. Jesse Grant was in Hudson, Ohio for a number of years when he was learning to become a tanner. And he actually lived with John Brown and his father, Owen Brown. Grant talks about this in the very beginning of his personal memoirs, but Grant was very dismissive of the raid. He says in his memoirs that he thought it was an act of an insane man to try to overthrow slavery with such a small force. So Grant was certainly of the opinion that this John Brown's raid was a mistake. But Grant, at the end of his personal memoirs, in the conclusion, he says that the cause of the American Civil War would have to be attributed to slavery. And on that count, Grant and John Brown would have certainly seen eye to eye on it.
All right. So our next question is, can you say something about the particular members of Congress Grant personally lobbied on behalf of the passage of the 15th Amendment? How many did he sway?
Sure, that's a good question. So interestingly enough, Grant had a really bad relationship with Benjamin Butler during the Civil War. Ben Butler from Massachusetts had been a politician in the years before the Civil War and was one of Lincoln's political generals. He had no previous military experience. So during the Overland campaign, Grant ends up firing Benjamin Butler. He just cannot work with him. But Butler becomes a staunch advocate of Grant, and they have a very strong partnership during Grant's presidency. John Logan from Illinois, I mentioned earlier that he was the author of the 1853 Black Exclusion Law that was on the books in Illinois when the Civil War broke out. After the war, Logan also has an evolution in his thinking and becomes a very loud vocal advocate for the 15th Amendment. So Ben Butler and John Logan are two people that I can specifically mention. Elihu Washburn from Galena, that had been a sort of a patron and supporter of Grant during the war. Grant will still continue to work with Washburn, even though Washburn actually had left Congress when he became president, but he's going to work with Washburn. So those are some of the first names that pop up. I also mentioned too that there are 14 African-American congressmen and 2 Black senators during the Reconstruction era, and most of those men served during Grant's presidency. So Grant is also going to work with African-American representatives in Congress as well.
All right. In a hypothetical third Grant term, what do you believe Grant would have done with Reconstruction policies?
Great question. Yeah, I think Grant, when he would have taken office in 1881 after winning the election of 1880, I think he would have been pretty serious about trying to restore civil rights for African Americans. I think he would have tried to get that course of action back on the wheel of the track again, so to speak. I think he kind of alludes to that in his world tour. So when Grant did his world tour from 1877 to 79, there was a reporter named John Russell Young who accompanied the Grants and wrote a 2-volume book called Around the World with General Grant. And volume 2 of Around the World with General Grant is particularly insightful because Grant talks about his presidency, and he kind of gives this impression that that Reconstruction ended too soon, and that Grant says that he extended his hand and tried to meet former Confederates halfway, and they can never meet him halfway, especially when it came to Black civil rights. Having said that, I think Grant would have had an uphill battle because the Democrats gained power in Congress, and a Democratic Congress would not have supported any sort of civil rights legislation in a third Grant term. So he would have had an uphill battle for sure.
All right, I'm going to combine 2 questions here because I think they're related. Did Ulysses try to be like Colonel Dent to try to win his approval in his marriage to Julia? And how did Grant's views on race/immigration differ from Julia's, and did she evolve as he did?
Great question. So I think Grant always had a difficult and tenuous relationship with his own father, Jesse Grant. Grant in 1854, when he decides to leave the military, his first concern is getting back to Julia and the children at Whitehaven. And I think for Grant, moving to Whitehaven is, in his mind, the easiest path to gaining independence and self-reliance for himself. It's the easiest path to get a plot of land, to have a place to call his own, and to not necessarily be under the yoke of his father. Jesse Grant had offered a job to Ulysses to work in Galena in 1854, and Grant turned it down. So whatever his attitudes were on slavery, I think he tolerates slavery. And again, he may have wanted to try to emulate Colonel Dent to an extent, because in his mind, that's probably the easiest path to independence and being able to support his family. Julia herself, she, in her personal memoirs, so Julia Grant was the first lady to write her own personal memoirs. And she wrote in her memoirs that when she became first lady, she opened up the doors of the White House to anybody, regardless of color. So again, that's something that you probably wouldn't see from a first lady in the years before the American Civil War. And there is a letter from 1881 where Ulysses Grant writes on behalf of Julia and says that Julia now believed that slavery was abhorrent. Having said that, though, in Julia's memoir, she really romanticizes slavery at Whitehaven. In many ways, I would describe her memoir as a plantation narrative aimed to celebrate and glorify the plantation lifestyle before the Civil War. So I think she always had a very, I think Julia viewed African Americans in almost childlike terms, kind of had a very paternalistic view towards African Americans. With regards to immigration, Julia also did have some nativist sentiments. In one part of the memoir, she actually complains about German immigrants in St. Louis. So I think while she did accept the results of the Civil War and accepted the end of slavery, she had her own nativist sentiments and her own prejudices as
well. All right. Did Grant and Lincoln ever discuss what would be the role of former slaves after the war was won, or was Lincoln killed too soon?
Yes, that's a great question. And pretty much, yeah, Lincoln was killed too soon. Grant, several times during the war, especially after the Emancipation Proclamation, he is very vocal in his support of the Emancipation Proclamation, which is noteworthy because not every general supported the Emancipation Proclamation. But Grant does admit in his personal memoirs that at first, in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, he actually believed that African Americans needed to receive education and have sort of a training process before becoming full-fledged American citizens and voters. But he admits in his memoirs that he changed his attitude with the presidency of Andrew Johnson. When he saw Andrew Johnson trying to subvert Congress, trying to actively use racist legislation to sort of enable former Confederates in the South, Grant said at that point he became a convert to Black voting rights, partly because of Andrew Johnson's own policies as president of the United States. So it took time for Grant to get to that point.
Did Grant have an opinion / contact with the Mormons in Illinois / Missouri and their multi-wife culture?
Great question. Yeah, so the Mormons were here in Missouri from about the 1830s up through about 1838. So Grant, at that point in time, he was too young to interact with Mormons in Missouri. I don't know of any interaction with Mormons while he was in Illinois. There's no writings from Grant's time in Illinois where he discusses Mormons. It really emerges during his presidency in these debates about polygamy among the Mormons in Utah during his presidency.
All right. Was Grant the general who initiated 40 acres and a mule? And how did that policy get nixed? Was it by Andrew Johnson? And if so, why didn't Grant reinstate it?
Good questions. Yes. Interestingly enough, it was actually General William T. Sherman who oversaw the 40 acres and a mule policy. and which is ironic because Sherman was actually very strongly anti-Black and held many racist views towards African Americans. But regardless, Sherman was overseeing this policy in the South Carolina and Georgia, the coastal sea islands down there. I guess it would be northeast Georgia and southeast South Carolina, where this act is being put in play. The reason for it is that many of the slaveholders and white residents in those areas had fled during the Civil War. The policy essentially called for the newly freed enslaved people to take those lands as their own and become farmers and basically start over their lives with their own farms. President Johnson is going to overturn it, A, because he does hold racist views against African Americans, and B, he is particularly concerned if the federal government had the right to take property from former Confederates. Hypothetically, it had the right to take property from other Northern Americans too. So in Johnson's mind, this is a violation of the right to property in the Fifth Amendment. So Johnson will overturn that policy of 40 acres and a mule. Grant himself does not comment on the policy specifically. And my assumption would be that if the president calls for it as general, he had to go along with what the president called for, the commander-in-chief.
All right, if you have the time, we have 2 more questions.
I certainly have the time. Thank you.
All right. What kind of first lady was Julia?
So, interestingly enough, Ulysses S. Grant was the youngest president, elected president at that time. He was 46 years old when he was elected, and Julia was only 42 when she became first lady. So, in contrast to other first ladies, Julia is still actively raising a family. The Grants have 4 children, and the oldest son, Fred Grant, goes off to West Point like his father did shortly after Grant takes it was actually right before Grant becomes president. But the other 3 children are still young enough that they're living at the White House. So Julia is very concerned about still providing a good upbringing and still allowing her kids to be kids. And there was actually a minor controversy because Julia ordered that a fence be put up around the White House in Washington, D.C. And so people complained about this. They said that the White House was the people's house and anybody should be able to go up to the White House at their own discretion and be able to go see the people's home. Julia said that no, she wanted a fence up because she wanted her kids to have a space to play. And she wanted her kids to be able to still have, a childhood. So Julia is very concerned about still providing a good life for her children. And Julia also institutes a new policy of encouraging the wives of senators to welcome diplomats from other countries to the White House. So this is a tradition that continues today where the First Lady and wives of prominent senators meet together to meet foreign dignitaries and welcome them to the White House and welcome them to the United States. And so she institutes this policy. And she also oversees a tremendous amount of renovations at the White House. During the Lincoln and Johnson years, the White House had fallen into pretty bad shape. And so Julia is going to oversee a considerable makeover of the White House during her husband's presidency. And likewise, some fiscal conservatives were actually kind of critical of Julia's her spending in renovating the White House during those years. Very popular first lady, though. Absolutely.
All right. And then our final question. So Grant participated in a few battles in both South Texas and in Mexico. Did Grant have opinions on the abolishment of slavery in Mexico and its effect on the U.S.?
That's a great question. And that is a whole other group, Mexican Americans and Grant's relationship with Mexico, that is worthy of a presentation in and of itself. Now, Mexico had abolished slavery after gaining independence from Spain in 1821. And during the war itself, Grant really doesn't state an opinion one way or the other. He considers it his duty as a soldier to join the 4th U.S. Infantry, and he goes down and he fights with Winfield Scott and Zachary Taylor. And does his part in the battles to help see the U.S. defeat Mexico. However, in his personal memoirs, Grant is extremely critical of the Mexican-American War and goes on to say that If he had had more heart, he would have actually left the army and not participated in the war. He thought it was completely unjust. He thought it was wrong for the United States to bully a weaker nation like Mexico. And he argued in his memoirs that there was a vast conspiracy, sometimes referred to as the slave power conspiracy. In Grant's mind, the James K. Polk administration fought in a war with Mexico to claim new territory and to expand slavery into the West. So Grant later on comes to believe that this is really just an attempt to expand slavery into the West. And he argues that the Civil War is an outgrowth of the Mexican-American War. It was a punishment to the United States for waging war with Mexico. So Grant is pretty vocal about that. And later on in 1880, after his presidency, Grant was actually elected president of the Mexican Southern Railroad. And he actually tries to oversee raising funds and establishing a railroad to go from Guatemala up to Texas through Mexico towards the end of his life. So he had a vested interest in establishing good relations with Mexico throughout his life. He was particularly close with Mateus Romero, who was a diplomat and a politician for Mexico, and Grant has a very close relationship with Romero during and after his presidency.
Great, thank you so much. So I would like to thank Nick Sacco of the Grant National Historic Site for joining us this evening. Do you have any contact information or social media you'd like to share with folks? You can drop it in the chat if you like.
I'll do that. Yeah, absolutely. We're pretty active on social media. Our username at the park is very simple. It's US Grant NPS. So I'll put that in there. And we're always adding new content to our website as well. So I'll put that in. We always got new work and new ways of looking at Grant's life.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening.